The last hymn echoes through nearly empty pews as 82-year-old Martha Henderson locks the doors of First Baptist Church of Millfield for what she knows might be the final time. This Sunday, only 7 people attended service in a sanctuary built for 200. Next month, the church that has stood at the heart of this Ohio farming community since 1887 will officially close its doors forever. Martha's story isn't unique. Across rural America, a quiet revolution is unfolding in white steepled churches and community halls where faith once formed the bedrock of daily life. From the wheat fields of Kansas to the coal valleys of West Virginia, small town America is experiencing the most dramatic decline in religious participation in its recorded history. In 1972, 92% of Americans identified as Christian. Today, that number has plummeted to just 63%, with the steepest drops occurring not in bustling cities, but in the very communities where church bells once regulated the rhythm of life itself. Something fundamental is shifting in the American heartland, and the implications reach far beyond Sunday morning attendance. The numbers tell a startling story. According to the Pew Research Center, rural communities have lost churches at twice the rate of urban areas over the past 2 decades. In Iowa alone, 270 churches have closed since 2010. Nebraska has shuttered over 200 rural congregations in the same period. These aren't just statistics on a spreadsheet. Each closure represents the end of a community gathering place that often served as the social, cultural, and moral center of town life for generations. But to understand why faith is crumbling faster in small-town America than anywhere else, we need to travel back to a different time, when the relationship between faith and community was woven so tightly that separating them seemed impossible. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we dive deep into the stories that shape our world. If you're curious about the hidden forces transforming America's heartland, you've come to the right place. The year was 1952, and Harmony, Kansas was thriving. Population 847, Main Street bustling with activity, and 3 churches serving a community where nearly everyone knew everyone else's name, family history, and whether they preferred their coffee black or with cream. The Methodist Church anchored the north end of town, the Catholic Church held down the south, and the Baptist congregation met in the building that also served as the community center. Church wasn't just about Sunday worship, it was the organizing principle of social life. The Methodist Ladies Auxiliary ran the annual Harvest Festival. The Catholic Youth Group organized the town's baseball league. The Baptist congregation maintained the community food pantry and coordinated disaster relief when the Smoky Hill River flooded. When someone fell ill, got married, or died, the church networks ensured no one faced life's challenges alone. This wasn't unique to Harmony. Across rural America, churches functioned as what sociologists call social capital, the networks of relationships that make communities function. They provided not just spiritual guidance, but practical support systems that government services couldn't match and that no other institution was positioned to deliver. Fast forward 70 years and Harmony tells a different story. Population has dropped to 312. Main Street has more empty storefronts than operating businesses. The Methodist Church closed in 2018 when weekly attendance dropped below 15. The Catholic Church now shares a priest with 4 other towns, holding Mass twice a month. Only the Baptist congregation remains fully active, though their membership has fallen from 180 families to 47. What happened to Harmony is happening across rural America, but the decline of faith isn't just about empty pews. It's about the unraveling of the social fabric that held communities together for generations. The first crack in small-town faith began not with theological disputes or scandals, but with economic realities that forced young people to make an agonizing choice: stay in their hometown and struggle financially, or leave for opportunities elsewhere. Beginning in the 1980s, family farms began consolidating at an unprecedented rate. In 1950, there were 5.4 million farms in America. By 2020, that number had fallen to just 2 million, even as farms grew larger and more industrialized. This wasn't just an economic shift. It was a cultural earthquake that removed the foundation upon which small-town faith communities were built. Sarah Mitchell grew up in Grundy Center, Iowa, where her family had farmed the same land for 4 generations. Her grandfather served as a deacon at Prairie View Lutheran Church. Her father led the church council, and Sarah sang in the youth choir every Sunday until she graduated high school in 1998. Then came the choice that defined her generation: Iowa State University, a degree in agricultural business, and the harsh reality that the family farm couldn't support another generation. I wanted to come home, Sarah recalls from her current home in Des Moines, where she works for an insurance company. But Dad was clear there wasn't room for me on the farm, financially speaking. The margins were too tight, the equipment too expensive, the commodity prices too volatile. He told me to get my education and find something stable in the city. Sarah's story repeated thousands of times across rural America. Young adults left for college and never returned, not because they didn't love their hometowns, but because economic survival demanded it. Rural counties that lost population steadily over decades saw their tax base erode, their schools consolidate, their hospitals close, and inevitably, their churches struggle to maintain membership. But the exodus of young people was only the beginning. The second wave of change came from an unexpected source: the very success of American prosperity. By the 1990s, improved roads, reliable vehicles, and the growth of regional shopping centers meant that small-town residents no longer depended entirely on local institutions for their needs. Walmart and other big-box retailers could offer selection and prices that local merchants couldn't match. Chain restaurants provided dining options beyond the church basement or volunteer fire department. Cable television and later the internet brought entertainment and information from around the world directly into living rooms. This convenience came with an unintended consequence. When people no longer needed their local community for basic services, the social ties that bound them together began to weaken. Church attendance, which had been reinforced by social necessity as much as spiritual conviction, became optional in a way it had never been before. Dr. Robert Putnam, Harvard sociologist and author of Bowling Alone, documented this transformation in meticulous detail. His research revealed that Americans were increasingly disconnected from social institutions of all kinds, not just churches, but labor unions, civic organizations, community groups, even informal social gatherings. In rural areas where churches had traditionally served multiple social functions, this disconnection hit particularly hard. The data is staggering. In 1972, 42% of Americans attended religious services weekly. By 2020, that number had dropped to 29%. But in rural communities specifically, the decline was even steeper. Weekly church attendance in rural areas fell from 51% in 1972 to just 24% in 2020, a drop of more than half in less than 50 years. Where are you watching this from right now? I'm curious. Are you in a small town, a big city, or somewhere in between? And what time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let me know. I love hearing from viewers around the world about how these changes are affecting your own communities. But perhaps the most significant factor accelerating the decline of small-town faith wasn't economic or social, it was generational. Millennials and Generation Z approached religion with fundamentally different assumptions than their parents and grandparents. And these differences were magnified in small communities where traditional faith had deep historical roots. Consider the story of the Riverside United Methodist Church in Broken Bow, Nebraska. For 107 years, this congregation had been passed down through families like a precious heirloom. The Andersons had occupied the same pew for 5 generations. The Kowalskis had provided organists for 6 decades. The church directory read like a genealogy of the town itself. Then came 2015, and the great debate over same-sex marriage that split many Methodist congregations nationwide. In urban areas, some churches adapted by becoming more inclusive, while others maintained traditional positions, with members sorting themselves accordingly. But in Broken Bow, population 3,500, there weren't multiple Methodist churches to choose from. There was one congregation, and it had to decide. Pastor David Herman remembers the meetings that tore the church apart. We had families that had worshiped together for generations, suddenly finding themselves on opposite sides of what they saw as fundamental questions about faith and morality. The younger members, the few we had left, largely supported inclusion. The older members, who provided most of our financial support, felt the church was abandoning biblical truth. The split was devastating. Within 2 years, attendance had dropped from 85 to 37. Three extended families left for other denominations. The youth group disbanded when only 2 teenagers remained active. By 2019, financial pressures forced the congregation to share a pastor with two other struggling churches. This pattern repeated across denominational lines and geographic regions. Issues that urban churches could navigate by appealing to diverse constituencies became existential crises for small-town congregations with limited membership and few alternatives. The generational divide wasn't just about specific social issues. It reflected fundamentally different approaches to faith itself. Older generations, particularly those born before 1960, tended to view religious authority, tradition, and institutional loyalty as central to faith. Younger generations approached religion as one option among many, emphasizing personal spirituality over institutional commitment and questioning authority structures that their elders took for granted. Dr. Linda Woodhead of Lancaster University has studied this generational shift extensively. Her research shows that while older Americans often maintained religious affiliation, even when their personal beliefs evolved, younger Americans were far more likely to abandon religious identification entirely when they disagreed with institutional positions. In small towns where young people already faced pressure to leave for economic reasons, this generational difference created a perfect storm for church decline. Then came 2020, and everything accelerated. The COVID-19 pandemic forced churches across America to suspend in-person services for months. While many urban congregations successfully transitioned to online worship and emerged with stable or even growing virtual attendance, rural churches faced unique challenges that exposed their underlying fragility. Many small-town churches lacked the technical infrastructure for quality online services. Their congregations skewed older and were less comfortable with digital technology. Most importantly, the social aspects of worship, coffee hour, fellowship meals, informal conversations, were impossible to replicate virtually, and these social elements were often what kept people connected to rural churches. Pastor Maria Santos of St. Anthony's Catholic Church in Las Vegas, New Mexico, not the Nevada city, but the small town of 13,000 in the high desert, watched her congregation shrink dramatically during the pandemic. "We went from 400 families to maybe 150 active families," she explains. "Some died from COVID, but many others just drifted away. When we reopened for in-person services, we discovered that a lot of people had found they didn't miss church as much as they thought they would." The pandemic also accelerated changes that were already underway. Remote work allowed more young professionals to live in rural areas, but many of these newcomers came from urban backgrounds and didn't share the religious traditions of their new communities. Meanwhile, longtime residents who might have maintained church attendance out of social obligation found that months away from services broke habits that had been decades in the making. But perhaps the most profound change affecting small-town faith wasn't happening in churches at all. It was happening in pockets and on screens across America. The rise of social media and smartphones fundamentally altered how Americans, particularly young Americans, thought about community, authority, and truth itself. In a small town where the pastor might have been one of the most educated people in the community, the internet suddenly provided access to countless religious teachers, competing interpretations of Scripture, and alternative spiritual traditions from around the world. 22-year-old Jake Morrison grew up in Faith, South Dakota. Yes, that's really the town's name, attending Calvary Lutheran Church with his parents and grandparents. But Jake's real religious education happened on Reddit, YouTube, and podcasts during his commute to the regional college 40 miles away. "I started asking questions that nobody at church could answer satisfactorily," Jake explains. "Not because they weren't smart, but because they'd never had to think about these things before. Their faith was based on tradition and community, not on wrestling with ideas." Jake's journey from believer to skeptic to what he calls spiritual but not religious mirrors that of many young rural Americans. Exposed to broader philosophical and theological perspectives through digital media, they began questioning not just specific church teachings, but the entire framework of institutional religion. Unlike previous generations who might have remained in churches while privately harboring doubts, digital natives felt empowered to forge their own spiritual paths. This created a feedback loop that accelerated church decline. As young people left, churches became increasingly dominated by older members, making them even less appealing to the young adults who remained in the community. Progressive young people left because churches felt too conservative. Conservative young people left because churches felt irrelevant to their daily lives. The result has been a hollowing out of the institutions that once provided the social infrastructure for small-town life. In community after community, churches that once anchored civic engagement have closed or merged, taking with them not just worship services but food pantries, youth programs, community meeting spaces, and volunteer networks that no other local institution was equipped to replace. The consequences extend far beyond Sunday morning. Research by Harvard economists Raj Chetty and David Grusky has shown that communities with strong religious institutions have higher rates of economic mobility, lower crime rates, and better health outcomes. When these institutions disappear, communities lose more than places of worship. They lose the social capital that makes collective action possible. Consider what happened in Antonito, Colorado, when the last church in this town of 750 closed in 2019. The building had housed not just worship services, but the monthly town council meetings, the volunteer fire department's training sessions, the 4-H club, and the community food bank. When the congregation disbanded, these activities scattered to various locations, some to the school, others to private homes, some simply ending altogether. "We lost our gathering place," explains former Mayor Patricia Valdez. "We're still the same people, but we don't have that one place where everyone comes together anymore. It's harder to organize things, harder to communicate with everyone, harder to maintain that sense of community that kept us going through tough times." The economic impact has been equally significant. Many small-town churches were among the largest property taxpayers in their communities. When they close, municipalities lose revenue just as they're dealing with declining populations and shrinking tax bases. Church buildings designed for specific purposes and often located in areas zoned for religious use are notoriously difficult to repurpose or sell. Meanwhile, the social services that churches provided, elder care, youth programming, emergency assistance, often disappear entirely. Rural counties already struggle to provide adequate social services due to distance and limited resources. When churches that filled these gaps close, vulnerable community members may find themselves with nowhere to turn. The political implications are equally profound. Churches traditionally served as training grounds for civic leadership and community organizing. Many rural mayors, school board members, and county commissioners got their start leading church committees or organizing parish events. As church participation declines, communities lose important pipelines for developing local leadership. If you're finding this deep dive into America's changing communities valuable, consider leaving a super thanks to support the channel. Your support helps us continue researching and producing these in-depth explorations of the forces shaping our world. But not every small town is surrendering to these trends. Some communities are finding innovative ways to maintain the social connections that traditional churches once provided, while others are reimagining what faith communities can look like in the 21st century. In Elkader, Iowa, population 1,200, the decline of traditional church attendance led to an unexpected renaissance of community engagement. When Trinity Lutheran's membership dropped below sustainability in 2017, instead of closing, the congregation made a radical decision. They opened their doors to the entire community, regardless of religious affiliation or beliefs. The church building now hosts the weekly farmers market, provides meeting space for the Historical Society, houses a community tool library, and offers after-school programming for local children. Sunday services continue for those who want them, but the building serves the community 7 days a week. Membership has actually grown as people who hadn't attended church in years began participating in the community activities. We realized that people still needed what the church provided: fellowship, mutual support, a gathering place. They just didn't necessarily need the traditional religious structure, explains Pastor Jennifer Larson. By opening our doors wider, we found our purpose again. This model is being replicated in communities across rural America. Churches are transforming from exclusive religious institutions to inclusive community centers that happen to offer religious services. The success of these efforts suggests that the fundamental human needs that churches once met for connection, purpose, and mutual support haven't disappeared. They're simply being expressed in new ways. In some cases, entirely secular organizations are stepping into roles that churches once filled. The library in Nucla, Colorado, has become the de facto community center, offering everything from computer training to grief support groups. The volunteer fire department in Lebanon, Kansas, organizes the annual Harvest Festival and coordinates emergency assistance for families in crisis. Coffee shops, community gardens, and makerspaces are emerging as new gathering places where neighbors connect and social bonds form. These adaptations point to a crucial insight. The decline of traditional religious institutions doesn't necessarily mean the death of community. Instead, it represents a transformation in how Americans, particularly those in small towns, create and maintain social connections. But this transformation isn't without costs. Religious institutions brought certain advantages that secular alternatives struggle to replicate. Churches provided continuity across generations, connecting community members to shared histories and common values. They offered frameworks for understanding suffering, death, and meaning that helped communities weather difficult times. Perhaps most importantly, they created obligations and expectations that encouraged people to show up for each other, even when it was inconvenient. Dr. James Davidson of Purdue University has spent decades studying the role of religion in American communities. His research suggests that while secular institutions can provide many of the social services that churches once offered, they struggle to replicate the sense of transcendent purpose that motivated much religious-based community engagement. When people volunteer at a church food pantry, they're not just helping neighbors. They're participating in what they see as God's work in the world, Davidson explains. That sense of ultimate meaning motivates people to make sacrifices and commitments that purely secular motivations might not sustain over time. The question facing many small towns isn't whether traditional churches will survive in their current form. The data suggests many won't. Instead, the question is whether communities can develop new institutions and practices that meet the same fundamental human needs for connection, meaning, and mutual support that churches once provided. Some promising models are emerging. In Vermont, a network called Co-Housing Vermont has helped establish intentional communities where neighbors share resources, make decisions collectively, and commit to supporting each other through life's challenges. While not explicitly religious, these communities incorporate many of the mutual aid and fellowship practices that characterize traditional church life. Online platforms are also creating new possibilities for rural community building. Facebook groups for small towns often serve functions similar to church networks, sharing information about community needs, organizing assistance for families in crisis, and maintaining connections between current and former residents. While these digital communities lack the physical presence of traditional churches, they can connect people across geographic distances and create support networks that transcend traditional institutional boundaries. The key insight from successful community adaptations is that the need for belonging, purpose, and mutual support remains constant, even as the institutions that meet these needs evolve. Small towns that acknowledge this reality and actively work to create new forms of social connection are more likely to maintain community cohesion, even as traditional religious institutions decline. Looking ahead, several trends will likely shape the future of faith and community in small-town America. Climate change and economic disruption may drive new waves of urban to rural migration, bringing people with different religious backgrounds and community expectations to traditional small towns. Remote work technologies may allow more young adults to remain in or return to rural areas, potentially reversing decades of outmigration. Generational change will continue as digital natives become community leaders and bring new approaches to organizing and communication. Some small towns may see religious revival as people seek meaning and connection in an increasingly fragmented world. Others may develop entirely secular models of community engagement that meet the same social needs that churches once served. What seems certain is that the small town America of the future will look different from the church centered communities of the past. The white steeple on Main Street may no longer regulate the rhythm of community life, and Sunday morning may no longer bring the entire town together in shared worship. But this transformation isn't necessarily a tragedy. Communities are remarkably adaptable, and humans are social creatures who will always find ways to connect with each other. The challenge for small towns isn't preserving institutions that no longer serve their residents' needs, but developing new forms of community engagement that honor the past while embracing the future. The story of Martha Henderson in Millfield, Ohio, with which we began, has an unexpected epilogue. After First Baptist Church closed its doors, Martha and several other former members didn't simply disappear. Instead, they began meeting monthly in each other's homes for potluck dinners and conversation. They coordinated care for elderly community members, organized the annual Christmas toy drive, and maintained many of the support networks that had previously operated through the church. We lost our building, Martha reflects, but we didn't lose each other. Maybe that's what church really was all about anyway. Not the place, but the people and how we take care of each other. As America's small towns navigate this period of transformation, Martha's insight may prove prophetic. The institutions may change, the buildings may close, but the human need for community endures. The question isn't whether small town America will survive the decline of traditional faith institutions, but how it will reinvent itself to meet the timeless human needs that those institutions once served. The bell towers may stand empty and the pews may gather dust, but somewhere in church basements turned community centers, in coffee shops buzzing with conversation, and in living rooms where neighbors gathered to support each other through life's challenges, the essential spirit of community continues. It's just wearing different clothes than our grandparents would recognize. What do you think about these changes? Are you seeing similar transformations in your own community? I'd love to hear your perspective in the comments below. And if this exploration of America's changing social landscape resonated with you, consider subscribing to Professor Archive for more deep dives into the hidden forces shaping our world. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep connecting with the people around you.